You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In the summer of 1779, an expedition led by Major General John Sullivan and Brigadier General James Clinton took place, starting on June 18th in eastern Pennsylvania and finishing up on October 3rd when they left Fort Sullivan, which they had built at Tioga, heading back to George Washington's main camp in New Jersey. This military campaign is known for its single significant battle at Newtown along the Comoon River in western New York. There, the large Continental Army forced the tribes to evacuate, and although this battle saw relatively few casualties, the real damage to the Iroquois Nations came from the widespread destruction of their crops, villages, and belongings. This scorched-earth strategy led to more deaths from starvation and exposure than from the battle itself, where 3,200 Continental soldiers overcame around 600 Iroquois and Loyalists, killing 11 Continental soldiers, 12 Iroquois, and 5 British soldiers in the process. This harsh military action was in direct response to the attacks on American settlements by Iroquois and Loyalists in 1778, such as those at Cobleskill, Wyoming Valley, and Cherry Valley, as well as the Iroquois siding with the British in the 1777 battles of Saratoga. Sullivan's forces were determined to stop these attacks once and for all, so they embarked on a mission to destroy at least 40 Iroquois villages across the Finger Lakes region of western New York. Their efforts forced survivors to flee to Fort Niagara on Lake Ontario, where they faced a brutal winter with little shelter or food, despite British efforts to help. The mission, while militarily successful, resulted in a tragic outcome for thousands of displaced people, causing many to suffer from starvation or cold. As the Revolutionary War commenced, both the British and the Colonial Continental Congress were eager to win over the Iroquois Confederacy, known as the Six Nations, hoping they would either join their side or at least remain neutral. The Iroquois found themselves torn on which path to follow, leading to internal divisions. A majority of the Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas, and Mohawks sided with the British, while most Oneidas and Tuscaroras supported the American revolutionaries, influenced by Presbyterian missionary Samuel Kirkland. This split turned the American Revolution into a civil war for the Iroquois. The Iroquois lands were strategically located between Quebec and the New York and Pennsylvania provinces. After the British suffered a major defeat with General John Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga in October 1777, both Loyalist forces and their Iroquois allies began launching raids on American settlers and the Oneida people. Led by figures like Loyalist Major John Butler, Mohawk Joseph Brant, and Seneca war chiefs Sayenquerachta and Cornplanter from Fort Niagara, these raids intensified the conflict. On May 30th, 1778, Brant's volunteers carried out a raid on Cobleskill, resulting in 22 American deaths. Following this and other attacks in June 1778, the Continental Congress's Board of War anticipated a full-blown war with the Native Americans. They proposed an offensive strategy, including a large expedition against both Fort Detroit and the Seneca territories to retaliate. Major General Horatio Gates was chosen to lead this mission, and funds were allocated, though the campaign was delayed until the next year. The violence escalated on July 3, 1778, with a brutal attack on the Wyoming Valley by Butler, Sayenquerachta, Cornplanter, and their forces, killing about 300 defenders and destroying the settlement. In response, Colonel Thomas Hartley attacked Delaware and Seneca villages along the Susquehanna River in September, and American forces also targeted indigenous villages at Unadilla and Onaquaga in October. The Cherry Valley Massacre on November 11, 1778, by Walter Butler alongside Seneca and Cayuga forces, killing and scalping soldiers and civilians and taking captives, marked a pivotal moment, leaving much of the region devastated. The Cherry Valley atrocity prompted a retaliatory strike by Colonel Goose Van Schaik against the Onondaga in April 1779, destroying their villages and crops and committing atrocities against the population despite orders to the contrary. With the British shifting focus to the southern colonies in 1779, George Washington seized the opportunity to strike back against the British-aligned Iroquois. After several generals were considered and declined the command, Major General John Sullivan took charge of the mission. Washington's orders to Sullivan, dated May 31, 1779, were explicit: total destruction of the Iroquois settlements, the capture of prisoners, and the destruction of their crops to prevent them from fighting back. Washington made it clear that no peace offers should be entertained until their complete devastation was ensured, aiming to secure future safety by eliminating their capacity to threaten and instilling terror through severe punishment. The campaign we're talking about was a major operation by the Continental Army, engaging over a third of its soldiers. General Sullivan was given command of 4 brigades for this significant undertaking. Back in April 1779, Edward Hand's brigade received orders to move from Minisink to the Wyoming Valley to set up a base camp for the mission. By May 1779, the brigades led by Enoch Poor and William Maxwell gathered at Easton, later joined by Sullivan himself along with Thomas Proctor and his 4th Artillery Regiment. To advance to Wyoming, they first needed to carve out a road through the dense wilderness linking the Delaware and Susquehanna rivers. This path was ready by mid-June, enabling Sullivan and his troops to reach Wyoming on June 23rd, concluding a march that lasted 5 days. Once there, the group was bolstered by additional forces, including 3 companies of Morgan's riflemen. However, a lack of supplies kept Sullivan's team in Wyoming longer than anticipated. It wasn't until July 31st that they embarked towards Tioga, located at the meeting points of the Chemung and Susquehanna rivers. This leg of the journey was tough, navigating mountainous landscapes while staying in line with the 134 flatboats that carried their artillery and provisions on the Susquehanna River. The convoy also included 1,200 pack horses, around 700 cattle, and a range of artillery pieces including cannons and howitzers. Upon reaching Tioga on August 11th, the troops started building what would be known as Fort Sullivan, marking the next phase of their expedition. This operation, right from its planning stages to the creation of Fort Sullivan, was a display of logistic coordination and military strategy in the rugged terrains of 18th century America. Upon reaching Tioga, Sullivan dispatched a small team to scout Chemung, a Delaware village located about 12 miles away. He suspected it was a gathering spot for indigenous and loyalist forces. The scouting team returned with reports of having observed a sizable group of both white settlers and Native Americans in the area, which appeared very disorganized. However, they were unable to ascertain whether the group was preparing for combat or planning to evacuate. Believing an attack was imperative, Sullivan left 250 troops at Tioga for defense and led his main force on an overnight march to Chemung. They arrived at sunrise on August 13th, only to discover the village deserted, having been vacated hastily. As part of Sullivan's strategy, Poor's soldiers ignited the village and annihilated nearby crops, while Hand's brigade searched for any indications of where the villagers might have fled. Nearly a mile west of Chemung, members of the 11th Pennsylvania Regiment fell into an ambush by 30 Delaware warriors led by Roland Montour. Despite the surprise, the Continental soldiers managed to retaliate, compelling the Delaware warriors to withdraw, albeit not without suffering 6 fatalities and another 12 wounded in the encounter. Subsequently, a squad from the 1st New Hampshire Regiment was ambushed while ravaging crops across the river, leading to 1 death and 4 injuries. Following these engagements, Sullivan's forces departed Chemung by the afternoon and journeyed back to Tioga, arriving there after sunset. James Clinton and his 4th Brigade gathered at Canojoharie along the Mohawk River. They carved out a 24-mile trail through the woods all the way to Otsego Lake, which is where the Susquehanna River starts. For about a week in June, a busy scene unfolded as wagons constantly moved back and forth, transporting supplies and 208 flatboats to the lake's starting point. Once there, the supplies were loaded onto the boats for transportation across the lake. Clinton set up his base at the southern tip of Otsego Lake in early July, and he waited there for the go-ahead from Sullivan to move out. On August 9th, Clinton got the signal to head towards Tioga. But there was a hitch. The Susquehanna River's water levels were too low for navigation. Clinton's solution was to have a dam built at Otsego Lake to boost the water level by 2 feet. This allowed them to move the loaded boats to a shallow area near the dam. When they broke the dam open, the increased flow helped the boats and their cargo float down the river, with Clinton's soldiers keeping pace along the riverbanks. Clinton and his brigade arrived at Unadilla on August 12th, and then at Oquaga 2 days later, finding both places already laid to ruins by William Butler the previous year. After taking a couple of days to rest, the brigade pressed on, destroying deserted villages and isolated farms along their path. By August 19th, they reached Choconut Creek's mouth, where they were met by large groups from Poor's and Hand's brigades, which then escorted them to Tioga. Clinton finally joined up with Sullivan's camp on August 22nd. On August 26th, the expedition set out from Fort Sullivan, advancing cautiously up the Chemung River Valley. Just before dawn on August 29th, Sullivan's scouts stumbled upon a hidden half-mile stretch of defensive log barriers. This position was held by a mix of British and indigenous forces, including Butler's Rangers, Brant's Volunteers, troops from the 8th Regiment of Foot, and around 350 warriors from the Seneca, Cayuga, and Delaware tribes. Sullivan quickly had Hand's brigade form a battle line facing this barricade, while positioning Proctor's artillery on a nearby elevation for better firing range. He also sent Poor's New Hampshire Brigade and Clinton's New York Brigade on a wide maneuver to the right, aiming for them to scale a steep hill and attack the enemy from behind. Poor and Clinton had just an hour to get into position. The plan was for the artillery to start firing, signaling Hand to feign an attack at the front, while Poor and Clinton would sweep in from the back. Maxwell's brigade was held back except for the 1st New Jersey Regiment, which pushed forward to cut off any potential retreat along the riverbank. However, the artillery began firing prematurely. Before Poor and Clinton had reached their designated spots, their approach was delayed by a swampy area that slowed them down. Realizing his forces were at risk of being outflanked, the British commander, Major John Butler, ordered a retreat. During this withdrawal, a counterattack by indigenous warriors on the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment, which was still trying to get up the hill, inflicted serious losses and covered the retreat of Butler's forces. In his report to George Washington, Sullivan noted his casualties as 3 soldiers killed and 39 wounded, with 5 of the wounded later dying from their injuries, bringing the total deaths to 8. On the other side, Butler reported losses of 5 Rangers either killed or captured, 3 injured, alongside 5 Iroquois killed and 9 wounded. American sources also mentioned capturing 2 prisoners and finding 12 indigenous people dead, including 1 woman. Sullivan and his troops embarked on a mission, laying waste to Newtown and a number of deserted Delaware communities along the Chemung River before heading towards Seneca Lake. Their destructive path led to the burning of Queanetquaga, known as Catherine's Town, Catherine Montour's home, and continued up the east side of the lake towards Canadaceaga. With each stop, they did not hold back, setting ablaze every building, destroying food supplies, crops, and orchards, effectively carrying out Washington's command for the total destruction and devastation of their settlements. After demolishing Canadaceaga, the force marched westward to the Genesee River area and Chenusio, also called Little Beard's Town. On September 12th, they set up camp between Hemlock Lake and Conesus Lake. Here, Sullivan sent Lieutenant Thomas Boyd from Morgan's Rifle Corps, alongside 26 riflemen, including Sergeant Michael Parker, and an Oneida guide named Thaosagwat or Han Yost to scout out Chenusio. They reached what they thought was an abandoned Chenusio, but they had actually bypassed enemy forces during the night. About 400 of Butler's Rangers and Seneca warriors, led by John Butler, Corn Planter, and Little Beard, geared up for an ambush. While Boyd's patrol was on high alert for enemy presence, they encountered 4 Seneca on horseback in the village, resulting in 1 Seneca's death and 3 escaping. Concerned that the gunfire would attract more enemies, Boyd decided to withdraw. They spotted additional Seneca en route, but chose to pursue them against Thaosagwat's advice, walking right into an ambush. Overwhelmed and outnumbered, 14 men from Boyd's group were killed, and Boyd, Parker, and Thaosagwat were captured. Thaosagwat was killed instantly by Little Beard, whereas Boyd and Parker faced torture before their deaths. When Sullivan's troops arrived in Chenusio on September 14th, they discovered the gruesomely mutilated bodies of Boyd and Parker. After taking down Chenusio, setting ablaze its 128 houses along with the surrounding gardens and cornfields, Sullivan doubled back. He was running low on supplies and wrongly believed that he had reached the western edge of Seneca villages beyond the Genesee River. Nearby the northern tip of Seneca Lake, he was approached by representatives from the Oneida tribe. They delivered a message from the Cayuga, who claimed they were neutral in the conflict. Sullivan, however, dismissed their appeals and sent William Butler with a crew of 600 to target the Cayuga settlements on the east bank of Cayuga Lake. Henry Dearborn and his 3rd New Hampshire unit were assigned the task of dismantling the villages along the lake's western shore, and William Smith with the 5th New Jersey focused on any remaining settlements by the western bank of Seneca Lake. Over the following 5 days, the combined efforts of Butler's and Dearborn's teams razed the 2 primary Cayuga communities of Goyoguen and Conodote, along with smaller villages and hamlets. Corriorgonel, home to the Tutelo who had been assimilated by the Cayuga, also fell. The harsh journey back to Tioga took a toll on Sullivan's pack horses, many of which could no longer serve due to fatigue from carrying the expedition's gear. Near today's Elmira, New York, Sullivan made the grim decision to put most of these exhausted animals down. Later, settlers would encounter their skulls arranged along a trail, a stark reminder of the expedition's passage through what became known as the Valley of Horses' Heads, now recognized as Horseheads. Returning to the Chemung River on September 24th with the bulk of his forces, Sullivan awaited the arrival of Dearborn and Butler. Dearborn's men made it back 2 days later, while Butler's group lagged, not joining until September 28th. By September 30th, Sullivan had regrouped at Tioga. They dismantled Fort Sullivan on October 3rd, and the next day embarked on flatboats for a 3-day descent down the Susquehanna River to Wyoming. Upon their arrival, it wasn't long before Sullivan received new orders requiring him to move his forces to West Point. In total, the campaign led to the destruction of 40 villages, countless individual homes, 160,000 bushels of corn, various orchards, and an immense haul of vegetables. Despite the extent of these losses, the expedition itself saw relatively few casualties, with the death toll, including illness, capped at 40 men. Heading further west, Colonel Daniel Broadhead led a parallel mission. By March 1779, Broadhead was in charge of the Western Department and was a vocal supporter of attacking the Western Seneca. Initially, George Washington planned for an attack from Fort Pitt as part of his strategy to punish the Native American tribes. However, in April 1779, Washington called off the expedition due to issues with supplies. Despite this, Broadhead convinced Washington that he had enough resources and men to launch the offensive, and on July 21st, Washington approved the operation. On August 11th, 1779, Broadhead set out from Fort Pitt with 605 soldiers, including troops from the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment, 9th Virginia Regiment, the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment, along with militia, volunteers, and allied Delaware warriors. The group moved north up the Allegheny River Valley into what is today northwestern Pennsylvania, territory of the Seneca. A few days into their journey, Broadhead's lead group, comprised of 15 soldiers and 8 Delaware allies, ran into 7 canoes carrying between 30 and 40 Seneca warriors. The Seneca prepared for battle after landing their canoes. The clash resulted in the death of 5 warriors, with the other Seneca being forced to flee. The skirmish slightly wounded 2 of Broadhead's men and 1 Delaware ally. Seneca oral history tells a slightly different story, claiming the Seneca were a hunting party taken by surprise by the Americans. The expedition then came upon an empty Seneca settlement called Buckaloon, located at the junction with Broken Straw Creek, and moved further to Conawago, which seemed to have been deserted months before. They pushed on to Yogrunwago, a group of 8 villages. The Seneca had abandoned Yogrunwago upon Broadhead's approach, leaving behind their belongings. Over the next 3 days, Broadhead's forces looted and destroyed 130 houses, seized livestock, and ruined 500 acres of corn. Although there had been earlier plans for Broadhead to join forces with Sullivan for a coordinated attack on Fort Niagara after destroying Yogrunwago, Broadhead decided to retreat. On their way back, from the mouth of French Creek, he sent a group to demolish the quickly evacuated settlement of Mahuskihikokan. The expedition concluded its return to Fort Pitt on September 14th, having traveled 450 miles in 35 days. In the culmination of their campaign, which took place toward the end of September, the forces led by Sullivan took a significant action. They dispatched Colonel Peter Gansfort and a troop of 100 men from Canadaceaga to the Mohawk Valley with a specific mission to dismantle the Mohawk settlement called Tiononderoga and to capture its residents. Sullivan had pointed out that Tiononderoga, situated right next to Fort Hunter at the Schoharie Creek's entrance, had been actively involved in relaying information to their adversaries. Upon reaching Fort Stanwix on the 25th of September, Gansevoort and his men, after 4 days, managed to take the occupants of Tiononderoga's 4 main dwellings by surprise, effectively capturing them. Gansevoort observed, and I quote, "It is remarked that the Indians live much better than most of the Mohawk River farmers. Their houses very well furnished with all necessary household utensils, great plenty of grain, several horses, cows and wagons." Following this, a group of local settlers who had lost their homes due to previous attacks by indigenous peoples approached Gansevoort and were able to convince him to let them have the captured houses. This decision of Gansevoort's did not sit well with everyone, however. Philip Schuyler, serving as the Commissioner for Indian Affairs and a member of the Continental Congress, criticized Gansevoort's actions, noting that the captured Mohawks were, in fact, strictly neutral. The Mohawks ended up being prisoners in Albany until the end of October, when they were finally released on orders from Washington. Canadian historian Gavin Watt criticized the British response to the invasion of the Iroquois homeland as incredibly weak and ill-timed. When France declared war on Britain in June of 1778, Quebec's Governor Frederick Haldimand became so worried about a potential Franco-American invasion that he concentrated on strengthening the defenses of the St. Lawrence River Valley instead of aiding Britain's Iroquois allies. Haldimand neglected to establish a long-planned outpost at Oswego on Lake Ontario, or to increase the troops at Fort Niagara. By the spring of 1779, it was evident to the British that the Americans were planning a significant offensive, though its exact target was unknown. Reports of a large batch of boats being constructed at Stillwater on the Hudson River hinted at an attack on Montreal. Additional intelligence pointed to American troops gathering at Albany and Schenectady, possibly aiming for a push towards Oswego. Lord Germain, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, thought the boats at Stillwater indicated an American movement up the Mohawk River towards Fort Stanwix, potentially threatening Fort Niagara or Fort Detroit. Meanwhile, Sir Henry Clinton, the British Commander-in-Chief in America, believed the main objective was to capture Fort Detroit, using a diversion up the Susquehanna River Valley to distract Butler's Rangers and their Iroquois allies. In May of 1779, Major Butler, leading several companies of Butler's Rangers and a unit from the 8th Regiment of Foot, set up at Canadaceaga, near the northern tip of Seneca Lake. There, Butler received word of American troop movements and supply hoarding at Canajoharie and Wyoming, which he relayed to the British commander at Fort Niagara, Lieutenant Colonel Mason Bolton, and then to Haldimand. Butler warned that an attack up the Susquehanna towards Fort Niagara seemed imminent. Haldimand, however, doubted these reports, suggesting Detroit was the likely target and surmising the Americans might be staging a diversion. On July 20th, Joseph Brant and his forces attacked Minisink in the upper Delaware River Valley, destroying buildings and engaging with a militia force 2 days later at Minisink Ford, leading to significant militia casualties. Captain John MacDonald's assault on Fort Freeland on July 28th further convinced the British of the American intention to target Indian country from Wyoming, despite Haldimand's continued belief that Fort Detroit was the real objective. In mid-August, despite differing strategies, Butler teamed up with Joseph Brant and native allies for a series of raids, culminating in a retreat after the Battle of Newtown. Following these events, Haldimand finally sent reinforcements in early September led by Sir John Johnson. This force, composed of various units and native allies, departed for Carleton Island, eventually abandoning plans for further attacks upon learning of Sullivan's withdrawal and the warning of the Oneida, thus concluding a series of strategic reassessments and military engagements during this turbulent period. On October 14, 1779, Congress expressed its gratitude toward Sullivan. A few weeks later, on November 6, Sullivan let George Washington know he planned to leave the Continental Army due to health issues, stating, "My health is too much impaired." He elaborated on his condition to Congress on November 9th, mentioning a severe bilious disorder from the start and throughout a Western expedition. Congress accepted his resignation on November 30th, 1779. By September 21st, 1779, Fort Niagara was sheltering 5,036 indigenous refugees, but by October 2nd, this number dropped to 3,678, and about 2,600 remained by November 21st. 2 Seneca villages managed to avoid destruction and welcomed some refugees, while others moved to Carleton Island or back to their destroyed villages into hunting camps, or after spending the winter at Fort Niagara, moved to Buffalo Creek area. The winter of 1780 brought extreme conditions, with New York Harbor freezing solid, allowing British soldiers to march from Manhattan to Staten Island over the ice. At Fort Niagara, the sheltering Iroquois faced harsh conditions with deep snow and persistent below-freezing temperatures, leading to the deaths of many deer and possibly some refugees from hypothermia, starvation, or illness. Francis Goring, from Taylor and Forsyth, wrote in October 1780 about experiencing the harshest winter ever, highlighting how the river froze solid for the first time despite its rapid flow. In February 1780, Continental Congress member Philip Schuyler sent 4 pro-rebellion Iroquois messengers to Fort Niagara with a peace offer, which led to their imprisonment and the death of one little Abraham in harsh conditions. The arrival of a large number of periodical cicadas in 1780 provided much-needed food relief for the Onondaga facing starvation post-Sullivan campaigns. This event is remembered by the Onondaga as a divine intervention. By early July 1780, 294 Iroquois previously aligned with the rebels sided with the British at Fort Niagara. Despite the Sullivan Expedition's intention to quell Iroquois participation, it led to devastating revenge attacks, with significant destruction and loss of life through 1780, as reported by John Butler and others. This period underscored strong continued Iroquois resistance, as remarked by authors Barbara Graymont and Joseph Fisher, as well as Major Jeremiah Fogg, noting the ongoing threat despite the destruction of their settlements. Post-war, the Iroquois were overlooked in the peace talks that concluded with the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Subsequent treaties in 1784 and beyond saw significant land cessions by the Iroquois to the United States, with the notable Haldimand Tract grant in Canada compensating them for their wartime alliance with the British. In 1788 and subsequent years, further treaties saw the Iroquois cede more lands, although the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua and the 1797 Treaty of Big Tree included acknowledgements of Iroquois sovereignty and land rights. George Washington's actions during the conflict earned him the name Hanodaganyas, or town destroyer among the Iroquois, a name reflecting the deep and lasting trauma inflicted on their communities, a sentiment voiced by Cornplanter in 1790, revealing the enduring impact of these campaigns on the Iroquois people. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.